Welcome back to the second video of the update on the Ford Model A here. Today we're going to be doing a quick, well hopefully a quick video on assembling a steering box for a 1931 Ford Model A. There are two different types of steering boxes that were used on Model A's in the 1928 to 29 models. They used a 7-tooth system, and in 1930 and 1931 they changed to a 2-tooth system, a little bit bigger gear, better torque ratio, which made the car easier to turn and drive. So we're going to be doing a 2-tooth reassembly. I've already taken this steering box apart. It needs a little bit of cleaning up still to do. I've got a new gasket set for it, and then we'll put it all back together, and I'll show you a couple other things about this particular steering box and column as we go along. So stick around, and hopefully you guys will learn something. So here we go. This is a kind of an exploded view of a steering box from a 1931 Ford Model A. Pretty simple, not a whole lot of parts to go to deal with. This is your steering sector. This is actually sits in here like so, and when you turn the wheel, this pivots back and forth, which then turns a linkage which connects to your drag link and then moves your wheels in there in its appropriate fashion. This uses a series of bearings. There's one bearing here in the bottom, and then there's another bearing that sits in this race, and this sits at the top of this housing like that. We're going to go ahead and clean up the rest of this. I've already stripped the paint and most of the remaining oil out of this box. So we're going to clean up these bolts and give it a fresh coat of paint, and then start the reassembly process. Now I'm not replacing any of these bearings. They're in pretty decent shape. If you were to replace them, you can get these at either Bratton's or Snyder's, or I think there's one other guy who sells Model A parts. But these are in pretty decent shape. This car had been rebuilt, restored, not too far away from before it was wrecked. So some of this stuff is still in pretty good shape. So this is the gasket kit you get when you go from Bratton's. It comes with a little paper gasket. This guy sits between this guy right here and the frame. This bolts onto the frame. You've got a cork gasket, and then there's also this kind of foam pressed paper fiber gasket. These, as is with most Model A's, they were kind of continually being re-engineered, and so there's different variations of the same thing depending on what year your car was manufactured in. In the two-tooth variation, they used either this one, which I believe was from like late 1929 to mid 1930, and then from mid 1930 through the end of 1931, they used this cork gasket. This particular one, we're going to use this cork one. It fits in here pretty well, so we don't have to worry about that guy. And then there's this little rubber O-ring. This was an extra part that I purchased that I don't need. And then there's this brass, kind of like a crush washer. It basically is just a rub point, and it just slides over this sector gear. Really quick, I guess I should explain which parts are which. This is your main housing. This is your sector housing. This is your sector gear. This is one of your main races for the top here. This is obviously your steering column with your worm drive, and that's pretty much it. This is, there's a horn rod, so the horn button travels through a rod that goes through this tube, and terminates at the end of this, and we'll kind of get into that. I also have some RVT, just gasket maker. Obviously in 1931 they didn't have this. I'm going to put it on anyway just because I have it, and it'll help kind of keep this thing from wanting to leak extensively. Model A's kind of work on the principle of if it's not leaking, it's empty. Some people might argue with that. The other thing that you should be aware of with these steering boxes, this has a pipe thread on it, and a lot of people will swap these out for grease zerks. If that is the case on yours, or if you find one with it that has been changed, I would suggest switching it back to just being a pipe fitting. People put grease in these. You're actually really supposed to put 600 weight oil. 600 weight oil is proprietary to Ford Model A's. You can still buy it. I know you can buy it from Bratton's Auto Parts, Antique Auto Parts. I use kind of a mixture, a half and half mixture of heavy gear oil. Sorry about that. Heavy gear oil. I just have 80W90 gear oil, and I mix it half and half with Lucas heavy duty oil stabilizer, and that makes it pretty well sticky and lasts a long time. You can use that mixture. 600 weight oil is used in the steering box. It's also used in the transmission and the rear differential of Ford Model A's. And the consensus among most car groups for Model A's is that a 50-50 mixture of those two gear oils should give you something pretty close. So let's get started. I'm just going to start off by dropping one of these gears, or excuse me, one of these bearings down in there like that. There's a race already fit in there. And then I'm going to take off this nut. And take off this little key. I kept the steering wheel is kept in place by a key, and I just put this piece of blue tape on there so it wouldn't disappear. And now it doesn't want to come out. I guess I shouldn't have been worried about that. I'm going to put this other bearing, it rides on the top of this worm gear, and then I'm going to drop this big guy on top of the rest of that. And then I'm going to very carefully slip this guy inside. You'll notice that on this main race there's this divot. It should line up with this screw hole, or this bolt hole. This is an adjustment to move this worm in or out from this casing. And so those two things should line up in there. You should be able to, in fact, before I do that, it might help with assembly if you just take a little bit of clean motor oil and kind of coat that. You shouldn't need a press to put this back into the steering box, but a little bit of oil will help with assembly and it won't hurt anything. You may have to try and persuade it a little bit. With a gentle tap of a hammer. So that should just kind of slide in. So you'll notice this guy has a very unique receptacle for the bolt. This is designed to center this onto this face so that this gear is in the correct position when it does that. Put your gasket in like so. Again, I'm going to use a little bit of gasket maker just as an added an added bonus. You don't necessarily need to do this, but it doesn't hurt. Oh, and of course, remember to put your gear in there. This gear sits, it's got a dimple on this tooth, or on this tooth end, and there's another adjustment screw on the other side of the housing that has a pin. Make sure that that pin sits inside that dimple, otherwise it won't sit right. Just slide that guy right on.